Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast. Today we're going to be asking, what is authentic yoga? Originating in ancient and pre-modern India, yoga today is immensely popular, with a huge range of practitioners, teachers and styles of yoga now existing worldwide. In particular, yoga has grown in popularity in the West over the last 100 or so years, developing into an asana or physically focused form of practice, one that we find in gyms, yoga studios, popular culture, wellness, well-being, the office, literally everywhere. From this proliferation of yoga today in modern Western society, one issue that has been raised is the question of authenticity. This question of authenticity focuses upon the fact that yoga has ancient spiritual, religious, and theological, philosophical roots. And it echoes this fear that the more recently developed modern or transnational articulations of yoga may actually be deviating from yoga's ancient origins, and consequently the true teachings and wisdom that yoga is said to convey may also be lost. As a result, many today look for a more authentic form of yoga. Modern practitioners are introduced to yoga. Maybe they start for well-being reasons, for fitness reasons, to help their mental health. But as their practice deepens, as they become more involved in yoga and yoga becomes more central to their lives, they seek something deeper. They see this kind of spiritual value of the practice, of connecting to their body through breath, movement, awareness. And they want to go deeper. They want more. They want more. And the same thing happened to me. This question of authenticity and this desire to find a more authentic yoga practice took me to India to do my yoga teacher training. And for many, yoga teacher trainings are the way that we deepen our practice, whether we want to be a teacher or not, typically in the 200-hour format. But for myself, I sought a more authentic yoga practice, whatever that means. And for me, that meant finding a course that prioritized the philosophy, and also finding a course that had dance in it. And my course was in traditional Tantra and Hatha yoga, and very much marketed itself as a more traditional and authentic practice. But nonetheless, I want to ask in this episode, what makes a yoga practice authentic? What are the criteria of authenticity? Many of us seek a more authentic yoga practice, but how do we know it's authentic? And in this episode, I want to suggest that there's really no easy answer to this question. That the history of yoga is immensely entangled with the philosophy of yoga, and simultaneously the philosophy of yoga is deeply entangled with the history of yoga. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that yoga has changed over time and continues to change. And if we look at the history of yoga, we can recognize that different forms of yoga have developed, responding to the needs of the time, responding to the context of the time. And as such, there's really no one authentic yoga across time and space. And actually, authenticity is not necessarily an external fact, seeking the authentic as something which exists objectively and universally outside ourselves, but rather authenticity is something we have to discover within our own lives. We can try different techniques and explore the history and philosophy of yoga, try and explore different traditions, but ultimately we're going to find the authenticity within. Hello and welcome to the Embodying Philosophy podcast. My name is Floss and I'm your host, a scholar practitioner, yoga teacher and geek for all things embodied philosophy. In modern times, we all too often think of philosophy as abstract ideas irrelevant to how we live our lives. But in ancient and pre-modern times, philosophy was a way of life. This podcast seeks to explore and revive this understanding of philosophy as a way of life, embodying philosophy as the practice of meaningful inquiry in relation to our lives as they are lived today in a pluralistic and diverse world, for engagement with ideas, practices, and traditions across time and space, from yoga to Christianity and beyond. So in the rest of this episode, I want to talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in relation to modern yoga and the question of authenticity. I might also talk about where yoga belongs. Are we more likely to find authentic yoga in India? And I think this will have to be saved for another episode, but it's really worth noting that yoga, or much of yoga in India, has developed in conversation with yoga in the West. So they're far from, separate things. But today I want to talk about Patanjali because Patanjali is often cited as the father of yoga. And he is the author, or we believe him to be the author, of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This text is estimated from 300 AD, so 300 Common Era post-Christ, and is seen as the first canonical text of yoga, offering a full system of practice and philosophy in succinct sutra form, sutra meaning thread. And within this text, Patanjali lays out his very famous eightfold yogic path, or the 8 limbs of yoga, which go from ethical and moral principles, the yamas and the niyamas, through posture, which is asana, breathing techniques, pranayama, withdrawal of the senses, pratyahara, and then 2 different stages of meditation, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So meditative awareness, and focus, one point of focus, and samadhi, which is liberation. And then this is also understood through different concepts such as kavalya, aloneness, or moksha, which is a very common word as well, which is freedom or liberation from samsara, from these cycles of death and rebirth, which are so central to the yogic and the Hindu cosmology, right? That the problem is suffering, and suffering is a result of attachment and action in the world that reproduces existence, as it were, in the material world. So after death, we are reborn, and these cycles of suffering, action, attachment to action, and rebirth continue. And yoga seeks to free us from these cycles of samsara. So in the search for authenticity in relation to yoga's ancient historical and philosophical roots, Patanjali's texts, and particularly his 8-limbed path, are often cited within modern yoga schools and yoga classes as representing the philosophy of yoga. So often if yoga teachers yearn for more authenticity, they might cite Patanjali, they might use that text in their class, in their teaching, in their self-study. However, I also want to recognize and identify a disjunction between the teachings of this text, or the teachings found in this text, and actually modern yoga, its practice and lifestyle, in comparison to the kind of practitioners and their lifestyles that those of Patanjali's era who would have been engaging with his texts may have had. So, as I said before, for me, history and philosophy are deeply intertwined. And in recognizing that, we might see that a text which was written almost 2,000 years ago may have a lot to teach us, as surely the Bible does as well, and other religious and spiritual texts. But also the context is different. And if we don't recognize that different context, then we risk really not in authenticity so much as deeply deceiving ourselves. We might call this spiritual bypassing. So in what ways may Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is one depiction of yoga made at one point in time, in what way might Patanjali's Yoga Sutra actually stand in opposition to many of the modern values of yoga? Well, firstly, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is underpinned by a dualistic Samkhya metaphysics or philosophy, an underlying framework of existence, which posits a separation between Purusha, spirit, and Prakriti, material existence. Now, what we find in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is a rejection of the body in favor of transcendence and the spiritual. So there's aspects of the sutra or parts of the sutra which actually are pretty critical of the body, calling it disgusting. And this is obviously, or maybe not so obviously, not really referenced that much in when people use Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. They tend to ignore that part of the text. But it stands in great opposition to modern yoga, which is very pro-body. It's very positive towards the body. So in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the approach is one of asceticism. It's world-rejecting. And it's really valorizing the life of the renunciate as opposed to that of what we might call the householder. So the life of the renunciate is that who renounces from mainstream society, from the worldly, in order to go beyond it. And if we think about modern yoga, well, as far as I'm aware, most modern yoga practitioners are not renunciates, and they don't reject the body or the material world. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other. This world-rejecting ascetic approach of Patanjali and the modern yoga, which is pro-body, affirms the material, body positive, world affirming. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just recognizing a disjunction between yoga and the values of yoga found in Patanjali and that of modern yoga today. So recognizing this disjunction in itself is not a bad thing. As I said before, yoga has changed and continues to change, shifting in terms of how it understands its goals, practices, philosophy, and its audience. And we see this across time. So with the development of Bhakti Yoga, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, which embraces the path of loving devotion and is more open to women, to householders, to children, to the poor, to the illiterate. And that path of yoga, which doesn't talk about asana or physical posture, is a path to God, which is open to other people who aren't necessarily renunciates. And we also see shifts from this underlying philosophy within the medieval period as well. So with the development of Tantra, Hatha, Advaita Vedanta, which is non-dual philosophy, we go beyond the dualistic Samkhya metaphysics that I mentioned earlier, and actually see yoga become more pro-body or more affirming of the body and of the material. But that too is a topic for another day. For now, however, I want to return to this question of authenticity. If Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is not that aligned with modern yoga, then which is more authentic? Well, really my argument is that authenticity is context specific. There's no universally authentic yoga, at least not in this world. There may be some deeper spiritual truth, universal truth, but its manifestation is particular. It's context specific. It's relevant for our lives. And part of the journey of embodying philosophy as a way of life is seeking that authenticity, not as an external thing in itself, but a path that we discover, something that we discover and continually inquire into. And actually, we might argue that even this desire to seek something that's authentic itself is rooted in a deeply Western epistemology or theory of knowledge or theory of truth. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you listen to the previous episode 5, where I asked what is religion, I talked a little bit about the Protestant Reformation and how Protestantism has really shaped our culture dramatically and our values and made them quite focused on belief and truth as a black and white thing. And there's a philosopher or scholar called, who I think I mentioned actually in the last episode, called Ramanujan. And he argues that there's a distinction between a Western and an Eastern approach to truth. And he argues basically what I've been saying, that in the West, there's this tendency to seek universal truth claims. So this black and white sense of what truth is. Whereas in the Eastern context, truth is more context specific. And if we look to the period before colonialism in India, there were many competing truths, as it were, many different cults and forms of religious expression which existed alongside each other in different localities. Different people would worship different gods and goddesses in different places. And simultaneously, there were also different paths for different stages of life. So I'm sure I'll do a whole episode dedicated to this, but the ashramas are the life stages. Ashram is like a house or a kind of place, an ashram, where people practice yoga in a community. And the ashramas are life stages. And we find this mainly in the Laws of Manu, which is a text which describes the Dharma of this kind of early form of Hinduism. And there are 4 primary life stages: that of the student, the householder, the renunciate, and the forest dweller. And these different stages of life have different goals. What is the highest value, highest goal, the highest form of realization one can have is different, is context specific based on where one is in their life, what their disposition is. And so there's a sense that if all of these people in these different life stages are practicing yoga, then the yoga will look different at different parts of their life, at different stages of their life. Because the renunciate and the forest dweller are preparing for death. So they are preparing for death. They're pursuing different goals and different values of the householder and the student, who are pursuing maybe wealth, material possessions, maybe pleasure. This is one of the virtues as well. And the life of producing family and so forth. And I can offer one more example in relation to this idea of truth being context specific, or the question of what is authentic being actually context specific in the Eastern context. And that is the different paths of yoga that we find primarily in the Bhagavad Gita, We have the Bhakti Marga, which I mentioned earlier, the path of loving devotion, the Jnana Marga, the path of liberative knowledge, the Karma Marga, the path of action, where one renounces the fruits of their action, renounces attachment to the fruits of their action. And finally, we have the Raja Marga, the royal path, which people often associate with Patanjali's Eightfold Path. And what we get here is this sense that there are different paths for different dispositions, that we are not all inclined to find meaning and truth in the same way. And actually, part of our life's journey, as I said before, embodying philosophy as a way of life, is exploring, seeking that, discovering our path. And I'll offer just one more example, which is from Buddhism. And it's said that the Buddha, when he taught his disciples, used an approach called skillful means. And skillful means that he would teach students differently based on their different disposition, because not only are they at different stages of their journey, but what is meaningful for one person will not necessarily be meaningful for another. It's not that relevant. And if only Western education could learn that from the Buddha, because if you've grown up in a mainstream school, I'm sure you will know that it's very much a one-size-fits-all approach. And that, we might argue, is a result of the influence of Protestantism in our culture, this black and white approach to truth. So as we come to the end of this episode, I'm just going to mention one more thing. Maybe you can think about this, have a little contemplation. And that is, where does our authentic practice, so we're seeking authenticity through trying different practices, but where does it actually exist, as a structure in our life? What are the institutions that allow for yoga to exist? Because authenticity is not just, I would argue, about a practice in itself. It's actually about the context and institutions which allow that practice to flourish and exist in a community and also in an economic system. And so I think this is a really, really important question for modern yoga practitioners and teachers today, is that yoga exists in the capitalist market. It's a commodity, and that context, in terms of yoga studios, in terms of teachers, in terms of making money, in terms of actually surviving and flourishing and being able to live a balanced life where you can afford to live, this is all going to influence yoga and how it exists. And if you did listen to the earlier episode, there's maybe a point of comparison. Is yoga a religion? People would probably argue no, although I would suggest it really depends on which context you're in and how you define religion. But in the last episode, I emphasized that actually we can think about religion not just as beliefs, the content of beliefs, but actually the context of religion, offering a context, an institution, a tradition through which we can pursue practice and ritual, and we can grow and connect to others and be formed as ethical and spiritual and moral human beings. Now, if yoga is a practice which forms us as ethical, spiritual and moral human beings, then what institutions and contexts allow that to flourish? And to what extent does capitalism and the capitalist context actually shape that kind of yoga, the kind of practices, the way we practice and connect with others? For example, we pay 18 quid for a yoga class and therefore we expect to have a good time. Does that exchange distort yoga or the way that our practice operates? And I'm not saying that all yoga should be free, because yoga teachers such as myself need to make a living, but it's just a question we can contemplate. Can we have some spaces of yoga community pursuing embodied philosophy and yoga as a way of life which aren't completely warped and shaped by capitalism. A question, if you have any thoughts, do let me know. I'd love to hear them. So thank you so much for listening to episode 6 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast. It's great to have you here. If you're interested in my work as well, you can find my website at www.philosophyandyoga.co.uk, and my Instagram is at philosophical_floss or at embodying philosophy. And you can find me teaching classes in Cambridge. I have some online courses and lots of exciting things in the pipeline as well, including workshops, continuing professional development for yoga teachers in relation to yoga philosophy, embodied anatomy, and much, much more. So have a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.